People in media have a phrase for when nothing's going on in the world. It's a slow news day. So they have to take boring stories and jazz them up and try to make them sound interesting.
Off-duty fireman saves duck. That was this paper's big scoop for the day. Aggressive, hard-hitting journalism there.
The first many years of Moshe's life, were one long, slow news day. In the beginning, we hear about how he's found and rescued from the Nile by Pharaoh's daughter. She gives him back to his birth mother to nurse him. Once he's weaned, she returns him to Pharaoh's daughter, who raises him in the palace, and we don't hear anything more about him until he's 20 years old. He's now the overseer of the palace when he makes his fateful decision to kill the Egyptian taskmaster who's beating the Jew. But what was going on during all those years, formative years, teenage years, when he rose to become the overseer of the palace? Nothing. Nada. We don't hear anything. No tabloids, no paparazzi, no pictures or videos of him squiring Egyptian starlets to red carpet events. Kept himself clean, restrained himself. Only Jew in the palace, steering clear of all the temptations that had to be in his path. Now, does that story sound a little familiar? Of course it does. We've read it before. We've seen the same thing with Joseph, only Jew in the palace, running the country, steering clear of all of the many temptations that were thrown in his path. It's not a coincidence that we see these stories back to back. Moshe was piggybacking on Yosef's restraint that he'd exhibited earlier. In fact, the sages explained to us that when our forebears, our ancestors, faced and conquered challenges, they imprinted that ability into our spiritual DNA. They gave us the talent, the ability, the strength to say no in the face of temptation, to pass those tests. The Talmud tells us a story of the woman who watched as 7 of her children were killed by an emperor because they refused to bow down to an idol. And just before the 7th one was killed, she went over to him and she whispered to him, "When you get up to heaven, find Abraham and tell him he bound 1 child on the altar. I bound 7. She was recognizing that she had grabbed the strength, the resolve to sacrifice all of her children for God from Abraham, who had previously demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice his son. And so rest assured, if you're facing a difficult challenge, one of your ancestors previously faced a similar one, and they passed that test. And you'll say, "No, mine's worse." That's a common argument. In fact, the sages tell us that somebody goes up to heaven, says to God, "How could I resist the temptation? My passions just overwhelmed me." And God says, "Really? You faced worse temptation than Yosef?" And you might say, "Yes, it's a different situation, a different generation, and yes, I am facing a more difficult test than any one of my ancestors faced." Well, what about the woman who had to sacrifice 7 sons? Avram was only asked to sacrifice 1. She drew on that strength, variation on a theme. She piggybacked, jumped on his shoulders, and gained strength from his prior act. And you might say, "No one's ever faced this type of test. I've got a one-off. Not only is it more difficult than anyone faced, I don't even have anything to rely on because nobody ever faced this type of test." Well, then guess what? If you're in that situation, I feel for you and wish you tremendous success. But you could be Roger Bannister. You could break the 4-minute mile. Once he did that, others were able to run a mile in under 4 minutes. You can introduce a new level of courage, of strength, of resolve, of restraint, of spiritual fortitude into the world. And then others can piggyback on that. They can follow in your footsteps.
Suspicious flashlight finds a hat in a tree. I could hardly believe my eyes when I saw it up there. Ominous clouds turn out to be nothing. A Swansea Town Council is considering getting a colour photocopier.